The Declaration. The Grand Conclave Hall was the biggest room in the known galaxy. That was not a guess. It was a fact, measured, recorded, and agreed upon by 47 different species. The ceiling was so high that clouds had been known to form near the top. The floor was made of a dark stone that came from a dead planet no one remembered the name of anymore. The seats stretched in wide circles, tier after tier, filled with creatures of every shape, every color, and every size. Some breathed oxygen, some did not. Some had eyes, some had other things instead. It was, by any measure, an impressive place. And on this particular day, High Warlord Suvrak of the Crethun Dominion was about to make it famous. He walked to the center platform slowly. He was tall, even for a Crethun. His scales were dark green with flecks of black, the kind of coloring that came only with age and status. His uniform was deep red, lined with gold at the edges. He wore no weapons openly, but everyone in the hall knew the Crethun never went anywhere without something sharp hidden somewhere. It was simply their nature. He stood at the speaking podium and looked out at the gathered representatives of the galaxy. He let the silence sit for a moment. He enjoyed silence. It made other species nervous. That was the point. Then he spoke. His voice was low and smooth, carried through translation devices worn by every delegate in the hall. Every word came out clean and clear in each species' own language. Honored members of the galactic sovereignty, he began, the Crethun Dominion has shown patience. For many years we have watched as a new species has pushed into regions of space that do not belong to them. We have sent warnings. We have sent diplomats. We have sent strongly worded documents approved by this very body. He paused. They have ignored all of it. A quiet murmur moved through the hall. The species called humans, Suvrak continued, his voice carrying a light tone of amusement, have expanded across 11 new systems in the last 40 years. They have built stations, mines, and colonies in spaces that border Crethun territory. They have refused to pay the sovereignty tax. They have refused to submit their expansion plans for review. And when our diplomats arrived to discuss these matters formally, their leader, a small female in a gray suit, offered our delegation something called coffee and told them to, and I am quoting directly here, relax. Laughter moved through parts of the hall. Even a few of the more serious delegates made sounds that, in their species, meant amusement. Suvrak smiled, showing several rows of very small, very sharp teeth. The Crethun Dominion does not relax, he said. And as of this moment, we do not negotiate either. Under Article 19 of the Sovereignty War Charter, the Crethun Dominion formally declares Homo sapiens, humans, a Tier 1 hostile species. This declaration authorizes full military engagement, economic blockade, and territorial claim over all human-occupied space. He stepped back from the podium. The hall erupted in applause, not from everyone, but from enough. The Breathkai delegates, who had their own trade disputes with humanity, clapped 4 of their 6 arms enthusiastically. The Sulvine delegation made their rattling approval sound. Even some of the neutral parties nodded along, because the Crethun were powerful and powerful friends were good to have. Nobody paid much attention to the corner of the hall, where the Vethali delegation sat. Ambassador Sarun did not clap. He did not rattle or nod. He sat very still in his seat, his 4 gray eyes fixed on the center platform where Suvrak was receiving congratulations from nearby delegates. Sarun was old, even by Vethali standards, and the Vethali lived a very long time. His skin was pale blue and dry, pulled tight over a frame that had grown thinner with age. He wore simple robes. He carried no title of great importance. But he had spent 60 years reading, not battle reports or economic charts, though he had read those too. He had read histories, old ones, alien ones, and for the last decade he had read every translated human document his people could find. He had read about their wars, all of them. He had read about a place called Thermopylae, where 300 humans held a narrow pass against thousands and nearly won. He had read about a cold land called Stalingrad, where humans fought house to house, room to room, sometimes with their bare hands in temperatures that should have killed them, for months, until the enemy broke before they did. He had read about a long, ugly war in a hot jungle where a large empire sent its soldiers in, and a smaller group of farmers and villagers held them off for years with traps, tunnels, and patience. He had read about a man who was shot, and then gave an hour-long speech before going to the hospital. He had read about a woman who, after surviving a bomb, went back to work the next morning. He had read about a species that had nearly destroyed its own planet more than once and had, each time, stopped just short of the edge, not because they were wise, but because some of them simply refused to let it happen. He sat in his chair in the grand conclave hall while the applause faded and delegates moved on to the next item on the agenda, and he made a quiet decision. He touched the small communication device at his wrist and spoke in a low voice. "Prepare my shuttle," he said. "I want to leave within the hour." His assistant's voice came back quietly. "Should I file the standard departure paperwork with the conclave office, Ambassador?" "No," Sarun said. "Just get the shuttle ready." He looked once more at Suvrak, who was now laughing at something one of the Breathkai delegates had said, his dark scales catching the hall's overhead lights. Sarun stood slowly, the joints in his legs making soft sounds of protest, and he began to move toward the exit. A young Vethali aide fell into step beside him. "Ambassador," the aide said quietly, "are you not staying for the rest of the session? There are trade matters that—" "The trade matters can wait," Sarun said. "Is something wrong?" Sarun walked in silence for a few steps. The great doors of the conclave hall were ahead of them now, tall enough to let in creatures 3 times Sarun's height. "Do you know," he said finally, still walking, "what humans do when they are frightened?" The aide thought about it. "They retreat like most species." "No," Sarun said, "some of them do, but the ones who matter, the ones history remembers, they get angry, and then they get clever, and then they get very, very dangerous." He pushed through the door without slowing down. Suvrak just frightened all of them at once. The aide hurried to keep up. "So what do we do?" Sarun stepped into the corridor outside the hall, where the noise of the conclave faded behind the thick walls. The corridor was long and quiet. Their footsteps echoed. "We go home," Sarun said. "We make sure our borders are clearly marked. We make sure every human diplomat knows that the Vethali had no part in today's vote." He paused. "And then we wait." "Wait for what?" the aide asked. The old ambassador looked ahead down the long corridor, toward the dock where his shuttle was being made ready. "For it to be over," he said simply. Back in the conclave hall, High Warlord Suvrak was handed a freshly printed report by one of his military aides. The cover page read, in clean official text, "Homo Sapien, a non-threat assessment, compiled by the Krethun Intelligence Division." Suvrak took it without looking at it and tucked it under his arm. He already knew what it said. He had read the summary. 200 years in space. No dedicated war fleet. No combat history against another spacefaring species. A small population spread across a handful of colonies. Children, he thought. He smiled again, shook another delegate's hand, and thought about which of the 11 human systems he would claim first. In the document tucked under his arm, on page 47, buried under tables and charts and footnotes, was a single paragraph that his analysts had flagged as low priority and that Suvrak had never read. It said, "Note, human historical records suggest this species has been in a state of near-constant internal conflict for the entirety of its recorded existence, approximately 10,000 years. Unlike most species, who trend toward peace as civilization matures, humans appear to have used their conflicts as a method of rapid technological and strategic development. Each major war in their history produced significant advancement in weapons, logistics, medicine, and organizational doctrine. In simple terms, the more humans have fought, the better at fighting they have become. This pattern shows no signs of stopping. Recommendation: further study advised before any hostile action is taken. The page had a small coffee stain on the corner of it. No one had read that far. Researcher Tika had been working for the Crethun Intelligence Division for 11 years and had never once asked to be reassigned. She asked 3 times in the same week. All 3 requests were denied. So she sat at her desk in the low-lit research room deep inside the Dominion's military planning station and kept reading. The room smelled of recycled air and old data storage units. Her 2 junior analysts sat at the desks behind her, and they had both gone very quiet over the last several days. Not the comfortable quiet of focused workers. The other kind of quiet. The kind that came from reading something that made you not want to talk. The assignment had seemed simple at first. Standard pre-war intelligence work. Gather all available information on the target species, organize it into categories, assess military capability, and hand the report up the chain to the generals who would use it to plan the campaign. Tika had done this before. She had profiled the Sulvine before the border conflict of 2 decades ago. She had done the Brethkai assessment during the trade war. Both had been straightforward. Look at their ships, their soldiers, their resources, their history. Build a picture. Tell the generals what they were walking into. She had started the human file the same way. She was on day 9 now, and she had stopped sleeping well. It had started with the biology. Standard stuff, she had thought. Humans were soft-bodied, warm-blooded, bilaterally symmetrical. No natural armor. No claws worth mentioning. No venom. Poor night vision compared to most predator species. Medium height, medium build. They could not run very fast in short distances, and their physical strength was below average for a sapient species of their size. On paper, they were prey animals that had gotten lucky. Then she read the next section. Humans had no fur to keep them warm, which meant their ancestors had nearly died in cold climates repeatedly. Instead of dying, they had invented clothing, then heated shelters, then, eventually, systems to reshape entire environments to suit them. The instinct to solve problems that should have killed them was apparently very old and very deep. She moved on to their planet's biology. Earth had been, for most of its history, genuinely hostile. The seas had creatures large enough to swallow smaller Crethun ships whole. The land had predators that were faster, stronger, better armed than humans in almost every way. Tika pulled up a reference image of something called a crocodile, a creature that had barely changed in 200 million years, because it was already so effective at killing that evolution had not seen a reason to improve it. Humans lived next to those, had always lived next to those. She looked up the predator-to-prey ratio on the human homeworld and found something that made her pause. Humans were technically both. There were things on Earth that hunted humans. There had always been. But there was also a very long list of things that humans hunted. And at some point in their early history, humans had crossed a line from being hunted more than they hunted, to hunting everything more than anything hunted them. They had done this without becoming faster or stronger. They had simply become smarter and more organized, and the records suggested significantly more stubborn. Tika flagged this section and kept reading. She reached the history files on day 4, and that was when her sleep started going badly. The wars, she had known there were wars, the summary had mentioned it. What she had not understood, not truly, was the scale and the continuity of it. Human history was not a timeline with occasional conflicts. It was a timeline of conflicts with occasional breaks. For 10,000 years, humans had fought each other. Not small fights, not border skirmishes. Enormous, civilization-shaking wars that killed millions of them at a time. And they kept going. Every time a war ended, the survivors had done something that no other species in the sovereignty's history had done quite so consistently. They had looked at what had just happened, figured out what worked and what did not, and then built the next war's tools based on that knowledge. In the space of about 200 years, humans had gone from fighting each other with metal blades to fighting each other with weapons that could end all life on their planet. They had built those weapons, and then they had not used them, not because they could not, because some of them had decided not to. Because even in the middle of the most dangerous standoff in their history, individuals on both sides of the conflict had quietly worked to make sure the worst did not happen. Tika found that the most unsettling thing of all, not the weapons, the restraint, the fact that the same species that had burned cities to ash had also, in the same century, produced people willing to stand in the way of their own leaders to stop a war. Humans could be monsters, they knew it, and some of them fought against it from inside. She moved on. She read about something called persistence hunting. In the early part of their history before complex weapons, humans had hunted large animals using a method that required no speed and no great strength. They simply followed the animal, for hours, for an entire day if needed. Running was the wrong word for it. It was more of a steady jog. Humans, unlike almost every other animal on their planet, could sweat. They could cool themselves while moving. Most prey animals could not. So the animal would run, stop, rest, run again, and the humans would keep going, hour after hour, until the animal's legs gave out from heat exhaustion and the humans simply walked up to it. They had hunted by being impossible to lose. Tika stared at that page for a long time. She thought about the war the Dominion had just declared. She thought about what it meant to go to war with a species that had evolved, at the most fundamental level, to never stop moving toward whatever it was chasing. She filed her first reassignment request that afternoon. The denial came back within an hour. She filed the second one. Denied again. She waited a day, wrote a more detailed third request explaining her concerns, and received a response from her division superior that said, in polite but firm language, that the assessment was a priority task and her expertise was required, and that the generals were eager for the final report. She went back to reading. She found the section on human military history that her junior analyst, a young male named Vreth, had compiled. He had done good work. He had organized it chronologically and included a summary table at the end. Tika looked at the table first. It showed, across several thousand years of recorded human warfare, the average time between a major military defeat and the same group's next major military campaign. The number was small, surprisingly small. Humans did not, as most species did, retreat for generations after a serious loss to rebuild and recover. They regrouped, rethought, and came back, sometimes within years, sometimes within months. There was a note at the bottom of the table in Vreth's careful writing. It said, "I'm not sure this pattern is fully captured by the numbers. The records suggest that human forces, when losing, tend to fight harder rather than seeking to minimize losses. I don't have a tactical term for this. I've been calling it spite in my personal notes, but I don't think that's an official military category." Tika almost smiled. Then she thought about it seriously, and the almost smile went away. She reached the last section of the research file on day 8. It was the part Vreth had quietly left on her desk without saying anything about it. The ethnographic section, culture, belief, tradition. Humans had thousands of religions. They believed in many different things. But Tika noticed, as she read through the summaries, that a remarkable number of their belief systems shared certain ideas. The idea that suffering made you stronger. The idea that death was not necessarily the end. The idea that sacrifice for others was the highest possible act. A species that had built its spiritual life around the idea that pain was a beginning, not an ending. She closed the file. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the research room. Behind her, Vreth was not typing. The other analyst, a female named Sas, was also not typing. The room was very still. "Have either of you finished reading?" Tika asked without turning around. "Yes," said Vreth. "Yes," said Sas. A pause. "I want it noted," Tika said carefully, that I am going to write a very clear recommendation in this report. I am going to recommend immediate ceasefire negotiations with the humans. I am going to put my name on it, and I am going to send it directly to High Warlord Suvrak's office. Another pause. Do you want us to co-sign it? Vreth asked. No, Tika said. I want you to have the option of not being attached to it when command ignores it. She began writing the recommendation. It was clear, well-organized, and backed by 11 days of solid research. It laid out in plain language why the Crethun Dominion had made a serious mistake. It referenced the persistence hunting, the 10,000 years of war, the pattern of advancement through conflict, the cultural relationship with suffering. It ended with a single direct sentence. In my professional assessment, we have not declared war on a young species. We have woken up something very old that has been sharpening itself for 10,000 years and has not yet found a challenge worthy of its attention. She sent it. The denial came back in 3 hours. Her superior's message said that her analysis was interesting but overly cautious, and that the military campaign was already in its planning phase and could not be stopped based on cultural observations. Tika read the message twice. Then she opened her personal communication log and wrote a short message to her family on the Crethun homeworld. It said she was well and was thinking of taking some leave when her current assignment finished. Then she submitted her resignation from the Crethun Intelligence Division. It was the first resignation the division had received in 40 years. Her superior sent a message asking her to reconsider. She did not respond. 3 weeks later, the first Crethun battle fleet crossed into human space. It was the largest single military force the Dominion had deployed in a century. The generals were confident. The warlord was pleased. The conclave had issued formal statements of support. Nobody had read Tika's report. Nobody had read past page 47 of the non-threat assessment either. The fleet moved forward into the dark between the stars, and somewhere ahead of them, in 11 small colonies spread across the frontier, humans were already receiving the news. And they were getting angry. Fleet Commander Dervak had won 9 battles in his career. He had commanded during the Sulvine Suppression. He had led the third push in the border conflict of 2341. He had been given medals for both. He kept them in a box in his quarters because he felt wearing too many medals was bad manners, but he kept the box where he could see it. He was standing on the command bridge of the Dominion warship Unyielding Claw when they crossed into the Eridani system, and he was not nervous. He had reviewed the human defense reports. He had 3 full battle fleets under his command, more than 200 vessels, the finest military hardware the Crethun Dominion could build. He had trained crews who had drilled the same combat formations for years. The humans had 17 ships in the system. 17. He had confirmed the number twice. He gave the order to advance and began planning what he would have for dinner. The first sign that something was wrong came 40 minutes later, when one of his sensor officers made a small confused sound and then said, very carefully, "Commander, I'm reading changes in the human ship formations." "They are retreating?" Dervak asked. "No, sir, they are reorganizing." A pause. "They appear to be spreading out." Dervak turned to look at the display. The 17 human ships, instead of holding a defensive line or retreating toward the outer planets, had scattered across the system in what looked, at first, like a panic formation. Ships going in different directions, no clear tactical shape to it. Then the first Crethun picket vessel was destroyed. It happened fast. A human ship, smaller than anything in Dervak's fleet, had come out of the shadow of a large asteroid on the edge of the system and hit the picket with something improvised. The analysis that came back 15 minutes later said the weapon appeared to be a modified mining charge. A mining charge, used against a military vessel. It had worked. The picket was gone, crew of 40 just gone. Dervac ordered an immediate pursuit. It was the obvious response. You pursue and destroy. The human ship ran, and Dervac's two fastest vessels chased it. And then the human ship did something that no tactical AI in the Dominion system had predicted. It turned around. It turned around and flew directly at the two Crethun pursuers at full speed. The Crethun ships, by doctrine, held their formation and opened fire, which was correct procedure. What was not in the doctrine was the small detail that the human ship had already launched 8 small drones before turning, and those drones had looped around during the chase and were now behind the Crethun ships, targeting their engines. One Crethun ship was crippled. The other was damaged badly enough to pull back. The human ship took serious hits. It was venting atmosphere when it finally broke off. Dervac watched it limp toward the system's second planet, one engine dead, hull scored black. He expected it to stop, to signal, to ask for terms. It did not stop. It flew on one engine toward the planet and vanished into a debris field around the moon, and Dervac's people lost the signal. 3 hours later, it came out of the debris field again, and his sensors said its hull had been patched, and it was running at 60% capacity. They had fixed it in 3 hours, while being hunted, using, as the analysis report put it, materials of unclear origin, possibly scavenged from local debris. Dervac stared at the report for a while. The main engagement came the following day. Dervac's 200 ships versus 17 human vessels. It should not have been a fight. It was not a fight exactly. It was something else that did not have a clean name in Crethun military language. The humans did not fight in formation. They did not follow any pattern Dervac's tactical AI recognized as a real battle doctrine. They broke into small groups, sometimes individual ships, and they went after specific targets with what felt, watching it happen, almost like personal grudges. 2 human ships spent 20 minutes focused entirely on Dervac's communications relay vessel, a low-priority target from any military standpoint, and destroyed it completely before being driven off. His fleet lost coordination for 38 minutes because of it. Another human ship flew through the middle of a Crethun formation at full speed with its shields clearly already failing, firing everything it had in all directions, less like a tactical move and more like it was simply angry. It destroyed one Crethun ship, damaged 3 others, and then kept going, coming out the other side of the formation still moving, trailing fire. Dervac watched all of this from the bridge of the unyielding claw and felt something he had not expected to feel. Not fear, exactly. He was a professional. He did not let himself feel fear in the middle of a command situation. But something close to it. Because his fleet was winning, clearly and numerically. They had destroyed 6 human ships. The humans had destroyed 4 of his, damaged 9 more. The math was entirely in the Dominion's favor, but every time a human ship was hit badly, instead of retreating or going quiet, it seemed to come back harder, as if damage made them more aggressive rather than less. He had never seen that before. The moment that stayed with him happened near the end of the engagement. His fleet had cornered the largest human vessel in the system, a ship called the Constant Horizon, against the gravity well of the system's gas giant. It was badly damaged. Its main drive was gone. It was running on secondary power. There was nowhere left for it to go. Dervac, following standard Crethun procedure for a clearly defeated enemy vessel, opened a communications channel. The response came almost immediately. The face that appeared on his screen was a human female. She was wearing a military uniform that had a long burn mark across one shoulder. There was dried blood on the side of her face from a cut above her eye. The bridge behind her had one whole section that appeared to simply be missing, replaced with an emergency barrier that was flickering at the edges because it was not getting enough power to hold a clean seal. Dervac looked at her and said formally, "Your ship is disabled. Your fleet is defeated. We offer you the honorable terms of surrender standard to the Sovereignty War Charter. Lay down your weapons, and your crew will be treated according to." She laughed. It was not a polite or diplomatic laugh. It was the kind of laugh that came from somewhere deep, the kind that surprised even the person laughing. "Surrender," she repeated, as if he had said something funny in a language she was still learning. She looked off to one side and said something to someone off screen, something that Dervak's translator caught as he said surrender. There was the sound of other humans making noises in the background. Dervak's translator interpreted the noises as laughter, multiple sources. The captain looked back at him. The bleeding cut above her eye had left a thin red line down the side of her face. "Commander," she said, her voice settling into something calm and steady, "we are just getting warmed up." Then she cut the channel. And then the constant horizon, a ship with no main drive and critical hull damage, turned itself using only its maneuvering thrusters, and flew directly at the unyielding claw at the maximum speed its secondary engine could manage. Dervak had about 4 seconds to process what was happening before his crew reacted, and in those 4 seconds he watched the constant horizon come straight at him like it intended to end both ships at once. His fleet opened fire. The human ship took hit after hit and kept coming, shedding pieces of itself into space, until it finally stopped moving, dead in space, 2 kilometers from the unyielding claw. It had not made it, but it had also not surrendered. What Dervak did not know, because the boarding party he sent found only an empty ship, was that the constant horizon had launched its escape pods 60 seconds before the final charge, while he was still talking to the captain. The crew had evacuated in an orderly way. Then the captain had sat alone on the bridge, piloted the ship directly at the largest vessel in the enemy fleet, and ejected at the last possible second in a single-person emergency suit. She was recovered by another human ship 4 hours later, cold and bruised and already arguing with the medic who was trying to treat her. Dervak's fleet claimed the Eridani system that day. On paper, it was a victory. They held the territory. The humans were gone. But Dervak sat in his quarters that night with the battle report on the table in front of him and did not touch his dinner. He sent a message to command that said the humans had performed beyond projected resistance and that the campaign would likely take longer than initially planned. Command sent back a congratulatory note about the victory in Eridani. Dervak read it. Then he looked at the part of his report that his analysis team had flagged as needing review. It said that in the 8 weeks since the war declaration, human colonies across the frontier had begun rapidly modifying civilian vessels for military use. Mining ships were being fitted with weapons. Cargo haulers were being loaded with drone platforms. The modifications were not elegant. They were not factory-built. They were improvised, jury-rigged, put together fast by people who were figuring it out as they went. And they were working. The report said that the rate of modification was accelerating, that humans across all 11 contested systems had shared their modification techniques with each other almost immediately, as if they had a reflex for it, that a design one crew came up with in Eridani was already being copied by crews in 3 other systems within days. They were learning in real time, sharing what worked, throwing away what did not, getting better every week. Dervak thought about Tikka's report, which had been shared with all senior fleet commanders before the campaign started, and which most of them, himself included, had skimmed rather than fully read. He pulled up the full version now. He read it completely, sitting alone in his quarters with his dinner going cold. He got to the last line. He read it twice. "In my professional assessment, we have not declared war on a young species. We have woken up something very old that has been sharpening itself for 10,000 years and has not yet found a challenge worthy of its attention." He closed the report. He looked at the wall of his quarters for a moment. Then he got up, went back to the bridge, and ordered his fleet into a defensive formation around the captured system. The generals back home would not like it. They wanted aggression. They wanted the next system pushed in the same week. Dervek did not care what the generals wanted right now. He wanted to know what the humans were going to do next. He did not have to wait long to find out. 6 months into the war, the Galactic Sovereignty held an emergency session. It had not been called by the Crethun. That was the first unusual thing. The Crethun had called the last 4 sessions, full of proud updates about territorial gains and confident talk about the campaign being nearly finished. This session had been called by a coalition of 12 smaller member species, and the agenda item was listed simply as the human situation. The chamber filled slowly. Delegates arrived in quieter groups than usual, talking among themselves in low voices. Several of the species that had applauded loudest at S. Suvrak's original declaration 6 months ago now sat with expressions that, in their faces, meant careful thought. Up in the Crethun section, the delegation sat stiffly. There were fewer of them than before. High Warlord S. Suvrak was not present. He had sent a deputy, a younger male named Grek, who had the look of someone who had been given a difficult job at a difficult time and knew it. Ambassador Sarun of the Vethali was present. He had returned for this session specifically. He sat in his usual corner with his usual stillness and watched the chamber fill. The session opened with a presentation that nobody in the room entirely wanted to be sitting through. A neutral analysis team, assembled from 3 species with no stake in the war, had been given access to all available battlefield reports from the last 6 months. They had produced a document. The lead analyst, a Drell female with 6 arms and the careful voice of someone reading a result she had checked 3 times because she did not believe it the first 2, walked the chamber through the numbers. The Crethun had entered the conflict with a force advantage of roughly 14-1. In 6 months, that advantage had dropped to 3-1, not because the Crethun had lost large numbers of ships, though they had lost more than projected, but because the number of human military vessels had increased. The murmur that moved through the chamber at that point was uneasy. The analyst explained how humanity had no dedicated shipbuilding yards for warships when the conflict began. They had built them. Civilian construction facilities had been converted. Mining platforms had been refitted into weapons platforms. In the first month, the converted ships had been rough, slow, and not terribly effective. In the second month, they were better. In the third month, a standardized modification template had spread through all 11 contested systems, and the results had been significantly more effective. By month 5, the humans had begun building ships that were designed as warships from the start, in facilities they had converted and then converted again, getting faster and more capable each time. The learning curve, the analyst said, was unlike anything in the sovereignty's recorded military history. She also talked about the ground situation. 3 of the 11 systems had Crethun occupation forces on colonized planets or stations. This had been expected to be simple. Occupy, administrate, extract resources, demonstrate control. What had happened instead was something human military historians, whose texts had been hurriedly translated and distributed to sovereignty analysts in the last few months, called insurgency. The humans on occupied stations and planets had not surrendered in any meaningful way. They had gone quiet. They had cooperated on the surface, answered questions politely, complied with curfews, and then in the spaces between those polite interactions they had organized, quietly, in small groups. Sharing information through channels the Crethun monitoring systems could not fully track, because the humans used informal codes built from their own cultural references, things that required years of human cultural context to understand. Supply lines had been disrupted. Equipment had failed in unusual ways. Crethun soldiers reported strange sounds in maintenance corridors that turned out to be nothing when checked. Morale in the occupation forces had dropped significantly in the 5th and 6th months. The official reason listed in Crethun command reports was environmental adjustment difficulties. The actual reason, the analyst said carefully, was that the occupation forces were exhausted and increasingly unsettled by the feeling of being watched in every room and followed in every corridor by a population that smiled and answered their questions and was clearly doing something they could not see. By month 6, 2 of the 3 occupied stations had reported losing partial control of certain sections, not through direct assault. The humans had simply stopped letting the Crethun into specific areas and dared them to force the issue through corridors that had been cleverly modified to give the defenders every advantage. The Crethun forces had forced the issue twice. Both times it had gone badly. The analyst finished her presentation and sat down. The chamber was quiet. Then it was not quiet, because everyone started talking at once. Grek, the Crethun deputy, stood and tried to deliver the prepared statement his superiors had sent him with. It said the campaign was progressing according to a revised timeline, and that the Dominion's forces were adapting to unexpected resistance, and that final victory was assured. He got through about half of it before a Breathkai delegate interrupted to ask, very directly, how the Dominion planned to deal with the human naval expansion specifically. Grek said they were developing countermeasures. 3 other delegates asked follow-up questions. Grek answered all of them with slight variations of the Dominion is developing countermeasures, and the revised timeline projects resolution within another 8 months. Nobody in the room looked like they believed him. In his corner, Sarun watched and said nothing. After the session, in one of the long corridors outside the main chamber, he was approached by a Breathkai trade delegate named Voss, who had been one of the loudest applauders at Suvrak's original declaration. Ambassador Sarun, Voss said, falling into step beside him, you don't seem surprised by any of this. I am not, Sarun said. Did you know before all of this? I suspected, Sarun said. I had read their history. It told me what they were capable of if pushed. Voss was quiet for a moment as they walked. The Breathkai have a trade situation we had hoped the Crethun would resolve for us, a human trade route that cuts through a disputed area. A pause. We may have been too eager to see this war happen. Yes, Sarun said simply. Is there anything to be done? Sarun stopped walking and turned to look at Voss. What would you like to be done? Voss spread 2 of his 6 arms in the gesture that meant uncertainty. The Crethun started this. That is a fact of record. What the Breathkai want to know is whether the humans, when this is over, will be in a mood to distinguish between those who supported the declaration and those who had reservations. Sarun looked at him for a long moment. I would suggest, he said carefully, that if the Breathkai have reservations, now would be a good time to express them, loudly and formally, through official channels. Voss understood. He gave a small nod and moved off down a side corridor. Sarun continued walking. That evening, from his temporary quarters on the Conclave station, he composed a long and careful message. It was addressed to the human ambassador, a woman named Dr. Priya Khatri, who was currently on Earth and had been, since the war declaration, essentially not receiving diplomatic communications from most of the sovereignty, because the Crethun had strongly implied that engaging with human diplomats was not in other species' interests. Sarun sent the message anyway. It said, in summary, that the Vethali people had not voted in favor of the Tier 1 declaration, that his people had deep respect for humanity's history and resilience, that they wished to be on record as advocates for a diplomatic resolution, and that if there were anything the Vethali could do to facilitate communication, he was available. He sent it and went asleep. The response came 14 hours later, faster than he expected. It was from Khatri herself. It was short, direct, and to the point, all qualities Sarun had noticed humans valued in communication when they were busy. It said, Ambassador Sarun, thank you for your message. We appreciate the distinction you've drawn and we remember who our friends have been. We would welcome a conversation at your earliest convenience. Khatri. Sarun read it twice. We remember who our friends have been. He filed that sentence away carefully. Meanwhile, on the Crethun homeworld, the mood in the High Warlord's strategic planning chamber had changed considerably since the early days of the campaign. The large tactical display at the center of the room, which 6 months ago had shown a clean series of arrows moving forward into human space, now showed a much more complicated picture. Red and blue markers were tangled together across 11 systems. Some systems that had been marked as fully secured were now showing yellow, the color the system used for contested. Suvrek stood in front of the display and said nothing for a long time. His generals stood around him. They were experienced males and females who had given him honest advice for years. Most of them were giving him careful advice now, which was different from honest advice in ways that were not comfortable to think about. One general, an older female named Vrix who had the kind of battle record that meant she could say difficult things, finally spoke. The humans are not behaving like a young species, she said. No, Suvrek agreed. They are getting better faster than we are getting better. I am aware. The original timeline. I know. A pause. The Conclave is going to start asking questions we won't want to answer, Vrix said. The Breathkai are already making noises about their original support. If they formally distance themselves from the declaration, others may follow. Suvrek looked at the tactical display. He looked at the yellow markers in systems that should have been securely read by now. He thought about the report his aide had placed on his desk that morning. Not a military report. A cultural one, forwarded from an analyst who had been studying human broadcast communications from the contested systems. It said that humans, across all their colonies and ships and even on Earth itself, had been sharing the same small piece of recorded footage with each other constantly for weeks. It was short, less than 2 minutes. It showed a human male, old, standing in front of a large crowd of other humans, saying something that the translation rendered as, "They picked the wrong species." The crowd behind him had made a noise that the translation system described as prolonged vocalization indicating high emotional intensity. Sarun's people would have called it a war cry. Every species in the galaxy would have recognized it as one. Suvrek had watched the clip 4 times. Call a strategic review, he said finally. Full command staff, I want every option on the table. He paused. Every option. The room was quiet. He had not said the word negotiation. He had not said ceasefire. He had said every option. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. It meant the warlord who had stood in the Grand Conclave Hall 6 months ago and called humanity children was beginning to consider the possibility that he had been wrong. Nobody said it out loud. That was not how things worked in the Dominion. But Vrix caught his eye for just a moment and gave a small, careful nod. And outside the Crethun homeworld, in the dark and the cold of contested space, humans were working through the night on their ships, sharing tools, fixing what was broken, building what they needed, and planning what came next. They were, as one human captain had said, just getting warmed up. The room where it ended was small. That surprised people later when they heard about it. They expected the surrender of the Crethun Dominion to happen somewhere large. A grand hall, maybe, with flags and cameras, and the kind of ceremony that history books liked. A moment designed to be remembered. Instead, it happened in a conference room on the neutral station Vethali 7, a mid-sized diplomatic post that Ambassador Sarun's people maintained at the edge of contested space. The room had a long table of pale gray material. There were 8 chairs. There were no flags. There was a window on one side that looked out into the dark, and through it, if you looked carefully, you could see the shapes of ships in the distance. Some Crethun, some human. All of them still. High Warlord Suvrek walked in with 2 aides and sat down. He had not brought generals. He had told no one at home exactly what today's meeting would produce. He had lost weight since the war began. His dark scales had lost some of their shine. He was still tall. He still moved like someone important. But there was something behind his eyes now that had not been there before. He sat down. He folded his hands on the table. He waited. Dr. Priya Khatri came in 2 minutes later with a single aide. She was a small woman, shorter than Suvrak by a considerable amount. With dark hair cut practically short and a gray suit that was clean and pressed but not expensive looking. She was not a soldier. She had never commanded a ship. She was a diplomat, and she had spent the last 11 months doing the harder, quieter kind of work that had made today possible, building the Vethali alliance, peeling the Brethkai away from the Dominion's coalition, managing 17 different back-channel conversations with sovereignty members who privately wanted the war to end, but did not want to say so publicly. She sat down across from Suvrak. Her aide placed a single printed document on the table between them and slid it across to the Krethun side. Suvrak looked at it. He did not touch it yet. Khatri folded her hands on the table and looked at him directly. She said nothing. She had learned, reading the xenobiological profiles her team had assembled on Krethun communication styles, that silence made them uncomfortable. She had also learned that they respected directness. She was prepared to be very direct. "I would like to discuss the terms," Suvrak said. "There is nothing to discuss," Khatri said, not unkindly, simply as a fact. Suvrak's jaw tightened slightly. "The third clause, the border systems. The Dominion has administered those systems for 80 years, Khatri said. "We know, we looked it up. They were also home to 600,000 Sulvine before the Dominion acquired them in a war the Conclave later ruled as procedurally irregular." She paused. "We are returning them to sovereignty joint administration, not claiming them for ourselves. That is in the document, page 4. Suvrak looked at his aide. The aide confirmed with a small gesture. Suvrak looked back at the document. The room was quiet. Through the window, one of the distant ships moved slowly, catching light. "The Dominion standing in the conclave," Suvrak began. "Will depend on the Dominion's behavior from this point forward," Khatri said, "same as everyone else." She let that settle for a moment, then added more quietly, "High Warlord, you declared war on us. We did not start this. We fought it because we had no choice. We are ending it because we do have a choice, and we prefer to live in a galaxy where things are resolved at tables rather than in space." She looked at him steadily. "But we will go back to space if we have to. I want you to understand that clearly." Suvrak was silent for a long time. He thought about a report that had come across his desk 2 weeks ago. Not a military report. A quiet intelligence note from an analyst who had been watching human communication channels. It said that a human research team, working in one of the contested systems during the war, had made a significant breakthrough in a weapons technology the Dominion's own scientists had been working on for 30 years without success. The humans had solved it in 8 months. They had solved it because the war had given them a reason to work faster. He thought about a separate note that said the human ship production rate, which had started at 0 dedicated warships and climbed steadily throughout the conflict, showed no signs of slowing down even as peace negotiations proceeded. Not because humans were building weapons to break the peace, but because they had started something and they finished what they started. They had built a military from scratch in 11 months. It would not unbuild itself when the war ended. It would simply exist, as a fact, as a thing that was now true about the galaxy. He reached across the table and picked up the document. He read it, all of it. He read it slowly and carefully in the way he wished his analysts had read the original non-threat assessment. Then he took the pen his aide handed him, and he signed it. Khatri signed her copy. Her aide and Suvrak's aide signed as witnesses. The whole thing took 4 minutes. There were no cameras. There was no ceremony. Suvrak stood, gave a formal nod that in Crethun custom meant acknowledgement of a completed matter, and left with his aides. Khatri stayed in the room for a few minutes after he left. Her aide, a young man who had been with her for 2 years and had survived the worst of the war's early period on one of the frontier colonies, stood quietly by the door. "Is that it?" he asked. "That's it," she said. "Should I feel better?" Khatri looked out the window. The ships were still holding position in the dark. "In a few days," she said. "Right now just feel like it's done." He nodded. "What happens to us now, to humanity, I mean, in the conclave?" Khatri picked up her copy of the signed treaty. "We get recognized as a Tier 1 protected species. We get a permanent embassy on the conclave homeworld. We get a seat on the security committee." She paused. "We also get watched very carefully for the next 100 years by every species in the galaxy." "That's not entirely comfortable," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's better than the alternative." She walked out. The treaty terms, when formally announced to the Galactic Conclave 3 days later, were read in full to the assembled delegates by a neutral Drell official. The chamber was full, standing room only, species who rarely attended in person having made exceptions for this session. The 3 border systems transferred to Joint Sovereignty Administration. Humanity granted Tier 1 protected status, a designation shared by only 2 other civilizations in sovereignty history. A permanent human embassy established on the conclave homeworld. Full human membership on the Security Committee with equal vote. The Crethun Dominion formally censured for unprovoked military aggression, a censure that would remain in the official record for 50 years. The Drell official finished reading and set the document down. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the Vethali delegation, all 12 of them, stood. They did not clap. They did not rattle. Vethali showed approval by standing in silence, fully upright, for 30 seconds. It was a formal gesture their culture reserved for things of real significance. One by one, other delegations stood. Not all of them. The Crethun delegation did not stand. Some others remained seated out of lingering caution or diplomatic calculation, but enough stood that the chamber looked, by the end, more full of standing figures than sitting ones. Sarun stood with his delegation. He was the oldest one in the Vethali group. Standing was not as easy as it had been. He stood anyway. He thought about the day, 11 months ago, when he had walked out of this same hall before the applause had finished, moving toward his shuttle, carrying a quiet certainty that the galaxy had just made a very large mistake. He had been right, and he was not glad about it, because being right about a war was not something you could be glad about. Too many people had died for it, on both sides. But it was done now. On Earth, when the treaty was announced, the reaction was not what an outside observer might have expected. There were no great celebrations in the streets, no fireworks, no victory parades. There were some parties in the frontier colonies, smaller and more tired than festive. People who had spent 11 months patching ships and sleeping in shifts and eating ration packs sat down and ate real food and went asleep for a long time. In one colony station, the captain who had told Dervac that they were just getting warmed up sat in the station's common room and drank something warm from a cup and did not say much. Someone asked her how she felt. She thought about it. "Tired," she said, "and okay, both at once." That seemed to be enough. 50 years later, a young Crethun student named Sira sat in a school classroom on the homeworld and listened to a teacher explain the history of what older Crethun still quietly called the disaster. The classroom was small, and the walls were the pale color that Crethun schools always used because it was supposed to be calming. The teacher explained about the declaration in the conclave, the assumptions that had been made, the intelligence reports that had not been properly read, the war that had followed, the treaty. Sira raised her hand. "Why did they not just talk to the humans first?" she asked, "before declaring war?" The teacher paused. It was, she knew, the right question, and the honest answer was not the comfortable one. Because, the teacher said carefully, the Dominion looked at the humans and saw only what was easy to see: small ships, short history in space, no apparent military tradition. She folded her hands. They did not ask what the humans had been doing before they came to space. They did not read deeply. They assumed they understood something they had only glanced at. What had the humans been doing? Sira asked. Surviving, the teacher said, for a very long time. Getting better at it every time something tried to stop them. Sira wrote that down in her notes. Later that year, she would read Tikka's report in its entirety. It was required reading now, in the senior years of Crethun military education. Every officer candidate had to pass an exam on it. She would read the last line of the report, the line that Tikka had written alone at her desk after 11 days of reading human history, the line that no one in command had thought was important. In my professional assessment, we have not declared war on a young species. We have woken up something very old that has been sharpening itself for 10,000 years and has not yet found a challenge worthy of its attention. Sira read that line 3 times. Then she looked up from her reading screen and out the window of her small room, where the Crethun homeworld stretched out in the late afternoon light, and she thought about the humans out there in their growing fleet, in their new embassies, in their permanent seat on the security committee, doing whatever humans did next. She thought it was probably best, all things considered, that they were no longer enemies. And in his published memoirs, which sold well across 14 species and were used in 12 different diplomatic academies as a case study in assumptions and consequences, Ambassador Sarun wrote the final lines that became, in the years that followed, the most quoted passage in any record of those events. I tried to warn them, but how do you explain to a predator that the creature in the cage has been counting the bars and mapping the exits since the very first day? How do you make the powerful understand that patience is not weakness, that stillness is not defeat? You cannot, usually. You can only step back and watch the cage open on its own. And when the dust settles and you look at what was in the cage and you understand at last what it was, you stop thinking about cages entirely. You think instead about being a very good neighbor. The humans built a good embassy on the conclave homeworld. Clean lines, practical design, a small garden on the roof with plants that did not belong there but grew anyway. Nobody was surprised.